Let us move on to the next trigger, which is the HTTP trigger. So if you look at the simple code of HTTP function, so this is the function attribute as discussed earlier. So this function is called create order. This is a HTTP triggered function. So the trigger, you can see that it's HTTP trigger. And then we have other attributes like HTTP request data, which is the input that is coming in from the request. And then we have the function context, which we already know that the Azure runtime creates for every function. So what we are basically doing inside this is basically reading the body of the HTTP request and then saying that, we have read the request, then sending the response back, which is a 200 response, and saying that the order is received. We are sending the body back from the request that we got as the response. That's a very simple HTTP triggered Azure function. Now we want to visualize it in terms of the 5 components, which is the main crux of any triggered Azure function, which is in terms of trigger, input binding, output binding, Azure runtime, and all that stuff. We'll go back to this diagram. So what you're seeing on screen is again the basic HTTP client triggering an Azure function. Then we have the line of code where we specify that this function is expected to be triggered by an HTTP trigger. And then we have all these parameters and the values inside that. So this function is triggered by an HTTP client through a post request. This is not triggered by any other request. We mentioned that in case you have not noticed, we have specified the method, the REST HTTP method as well. So if we receive a get for this method, a get request, this method won't be triggered. This method will be triggered only with a post request. The HTTP client with a post request is what wakes up this function. And then the Azure Functions runtime, it parses the HTTP request, it creates the context, and whatever metadata we require for the particular context, for the particular trigger available in the function context, whatever HTTP data, request data we want is taken care in the request object. As you can see, HTTP request data. So the Azure runtime binds all the request information into this particular object. Then as mentioned, the input binding is HTTP request data. Then we have our function code which receives this request data and also can make use of the context and does some custom logic based on a requirement or use case, talk to database, talk to external resources. And you can specify the output binding. In this case, the output binding is nothing but the HTTP response data, as you have seen in the method signature. It's called HTTP response data. So we send the response, the JSON response back to the caller, whoever is calling this function. So that's what we are doing over here. So that's in a nutshell how a HTTP triggered function runs.